Okay, I think we can get started now. Hi everyone. Welcome. I know we've been on a bit of a hiatus, so welcome back, I guess. I'm seeing a few new names in the group chat, and just as a bit of, I don't know if you've updated on our website. It's a bit of a logistics thing. We have like several different WhatsApp groups now because one of them's full. So um, um, there might be a bit of a discontinuity in some of the communications, but that's just something we've been trying to work in. But anyway, on to the session, I guess. Welcome back, everyone. This sort of we didn't really plan this, but given everything that's going on in Indonesia right now, I think this session feels a bit serendipitous because we'll be talking about a lot of the issues, particularly regarding the nation state, that I think will feel quite resonant and relevant with everything that's going on. As Alcia puts it in our Instagram story, how could the state do this to its own citizens? Like, how does it justify it? And hopefully today we can sort of start thinking about how that might happen. And so, oh, sorry. Okay. So let me circle back to where we left off a few weeks ago, where we were talking about Spivak. And Spivak here, there's this quote from an interview she has where she almost suggests that decolonial anti-colonial nationalism and decolonization was a sectional thing, right? And that's what she says here, where there was a certain elite that took to it, that clearly saw the benefits of it, but then you have this big chunk of a subaltern population, a population that literally cannot speak. Again, if you remember Spivak from last time, for whom nationalism didn't mean at least the same thing or even as much as as it did for the elite. That decolonization was only happened on one layer, but it never reached the subaltern layer. Whatever we think about that, that's sort of a frame that we want to think about going forward, which is who is nationalism for? Who is the nation state for? And to start thinking along that direction, I I want to just walk us through a few more sort of more real life examples, I guess, where again we're sort of familiar with this narrative of independence, national independence, as a kind of emancipation, right? Um, and that's sort of very familiar to all of us. But that's like almost like a century ago, right? Let's think about more contemporary stuff, like development. Can development be seen as a kind of emancipation? And sometimes that's sort of how it's portrayed, almost, right? Like, okay, we have our nation, we have our country, and they want it to be self-sufficient. We want it to be free from foreign economic control. So that, in that sense, development can be seen as a kind of emancipation, right? And here I have as an example the cacao industry, and I'm thinking specifically about the SBA presidency when there was this very concerted effort to develop and hilirisasi, sort of downstream processing, I guess, of the cacao industry, and it was largely successful. And that's sort of seen as a test case of how, okay, see, this is a good thing. Now we can sort of grow our own stuff and we're self-sufficient and everything is great because we're not reliant on other countries. Therefore, the nation is emancipated. But there is also a darker side of this, right? Where a lot of things happen in the name of development that is, again, it's sold as emancipation, but is it really emancipation? When you sort of clear out large tracts of land in, say, Sulawesi or Papua, and that sort of harms a lot of indigenous communities. Or, for example, when you have pemukiman and sort of like shanty towns like cleared out for development projects, is that really emancipation? And again, the rhetoric is of emancipation, but is it really? So that's sort of what we want to think about. And what I want to highlight in all of these three cases is that
Oh,
there's a sort of a running thread, which is the role of the state, right? In all of these cases that I've presented, the state plays a central role. The state is seen as the vehicle, as the instrument, as the agent that will sort of emancipate. And so I want us to start with a bunch of questions. Usually, this is where I do a bit of a brainstorming exercise. I'm going to skip that for now. I'm going to leave that till the end. I think that makes more sense for this class. But I want us to think about these questions as they'll sort of like take us through as sort of like the organizing principles of this class, which is, again, what is emancipation, really, right? And when we talk about emancipation, we necessarily have to think about the subject of emancipating too, right? Who are we exactly emancipating? Do they need to be emancipated? And then again, to the underlying question, can the state be an emancipatory instrument? And really, again, what really is even the state, right? Again, that's sort of the sort of things we'll start to think through today. And following the tradition of this module, we'll be doing it through sort of a canonical text from sort of the Enlightenment tradition. And here I'm focusing specifically on Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan, which is sort of this very foundational text in modern Western political theory. And you might be thinking, what does Hobbes have to do with me? What does Hobbes have to do with Indonesia? I promise you there will be a payoff. Hobbes is important, and in ways that have to do with the fact that, again, he comes from this very specific European context, and yet we still talk about him. So Hobbes. But we'll be focusing on Leviathan, and this is the famous frontispiece, and we'll sort of go into it a bit more as well later. But just some important context. Hobbes writes in the shadow of a series of like very vicious religious warfare in Europe. So again, this was after the Protestant Reformation, and you had these vicious, savage conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. You had the 30 Years' War in sort of Holy Roman Empire, now Germany. In France, you had the religious wars. And then Hobbes himself experienced the English Civil War, which again was very religiously driven. That backdrop is very, very, very important in understanding Leviathan. And two of Hobbes' sort of most major works, Leviathan and another one, Behemoth, again, these are biblical allegories. Leviathan and Behemoth, these sort of violent, uncontrollable, primal creatures from the Old Testament. And again, that sort of religious allegory is something you want to keep in mind, especially in connection with sort of this context. But before we get to Hobbes, I want to, again, circle back again, finally, to Spivak again. And what we were talking about last time about subjects, not in terms of sort of the subject of a ruler, but sort of like subject as in like, oh, I am the subject of my own story. You are the subject of this text. That's sort of what we want to think about, how we want to think about subject. And Spivak, what Spivak really highlights in our discussions last time is that often when we're dealing with a text, when we're dealing with a theory, there is often a hidden subject smuggled inside. The way, and again, here I have a few examples, right? When you read sort of a political text or you read an article and they say, humans are naturally, okay, what humans, right? What kind of humans are we talking about? Or when someone just proclaims, and this is going to be important for our topic for today, which is politics, right? We obviously do not want this. We obviously think this way. We obviously never really, again, who is this we? And that's sort of the subject that we really want to interrogate today. Who is this we, right? Because, I don't know if you've had this experience, I certainly have, like when you have family members or friends, and then they just go, yes, we agree, and they've never asked you, right? Like I'll have moments where like my sister or someone is like responding to my parent and goes, okay, yeah, we agree, we think this way. And she hasn't really consulted me, right? And so who is this we? Who is this we that sort of is embedded into everything? And the example, of course, that we've been dealing with over the past several sessions is the subject of the Enlightenment, where who is this we? Who is the subject? Subject is a creature that reasons, with a Cartesian kind of individual subjectivity that goes, oh, I think this way, and then you have this sort of inner life. And then if you talk about Adam Smith, the subject also likes to, again, barter and truck, likes to exchange and barter and also do all these economic activities. And then also, this subject is quite literally a man, the Enlightenment man. And this is what Wollstonecraft was critiquing a few weeks ago. And again, Spivak's sort of intervention is to say that this is rooted in a deeply and specific. Sorry. You need to use. Sorry. Sorry about that. And Spivak's sort of intervention is to say that all of this is presented as a sort of a universal figure, man again, right? Man, it's sort of that's all of us, that's we. But this is rooted again in a very specific European history and experience, but it presents itself as a universal we. So that's sort of the idea of subjects. And why does it matter for what we're talking about today? Because in politics, this subject is very important. There is an implicit protagonist in every political theory, in every political story, in every political narrative. And we want to think hard about who exactly is this we? Who exactly is the subject? And so one of the examples I have here is Aristotle and his politics. And Aristotle starts by sort of defining, okay, he starts with the Nicomachean Ethics, where he sort of describes like how humans sort of should act. And there you already kind of see a subject, right? It's a universal human being. It's just, again, it's like kind of like the Enlightenment man, like it's the Aristotelian man, almost, this abstract mankind. And then they get together in the politics to form a polity, right? And again, this feels unnatural if you've been steeped in canonical Western political theory, because this is assumed. This is assumed. You never like go into like how this is constructed, right? There's a universal human. You try first to define what is a man, and then you describe that man as a political subject. There's again universal man, universal human being, and to just highlight how it's not all. This is not always the subject of politics. I have here as comparison two other texts. The Pararaton, as again, it's sort of this annal of like this is a history of sort of Javanese kings stretching from Singasari, I think that's if I remember correctly. And here again, the subject is very different. It's not universal man. It's literally the royal lineage. That's the protagonist, right? It's the bloodline stretching from Singasari to Majapahit. It's the bloodline that's the subject of this political story, not Aristotle's universal man and how he reasons through a political community. Another example is the Hikayat Hang Tuah, where again the figure is literally, then again the protagonist is literally a person, Hang Tuah, this mythical kind of like again if you're more steeped in the Western tradition, like Hercules or Theseus or something like that. So again, political protagonists aren't always the same, and this is important because that's sort of important to understanding Leviathan and trying to unpack who is the assumed subject of Leviathan. And Leviathan is important because it is, I argue, a very foundational text in Western liberal political thought. And a lot of the institutions that we see today, both in the West, but also in the post-colonial world, are founded on this logic. And when they're founded on this logic, you kind of want to figure out who is the subject. Because, and again, this is where Hobbes gets interesting in a post-colonial context. The subject changes. The institutions, the language doesn't change, but the subject changes. And we're going to see how that works in a minute. So first, Leviathan. And here again, it's a political text. It's sort of, he tries to ask how do commonwealths, how do political communities form? What are they like? Why do we need them? And note that for a political text, the first part, and this occupies around a third of Leviathan, is called Of Man. So again, this is in the classical Western theoretical tradition, right? He first tries to define a universal man. He's following in Aristotle's footsteps in that sense. And so, in other words, Hobbes begins by setting up his political protagonist, his political subject, and that is universal man. And to sort of hint at what Leviathan is getting at, I have this quote from Hobbes And the language he uses is very interesting. And he first describes nature, and nature is sort of like this thing where God creates all of these things in the world, including man. And then we as humans can emulate nature in creating our own things. And we can also, if we do things properly, create an artificial animal, an artificial human being. What is this? It's Leviathan. It's the state. It's the political community. The political community, Leviathan, is an artificial man that we have created. Again, think of the biblical, the religious inversions. It's sort of almost like seizing sort of God's power to sort of create a human being. Um, so let's dive deeper into this, and let's sort of first try to unpack the Hobbesian subject, sort of the central figure in so much modern liberal political discourse. And it's his description of human beings is very mechanistic. It's almost like he's describing a robot or an automaton. And then this quote is again it's very, very revealing, right? Like you have a bunch of limbs, and then the limbs are like automata, they're like engines, and then the heart is like a spring, the nerves are like strings. It's like humans are machines, and that goes back to this sort of artificial animal conception, right? He thinks of people as these very sort of clockwork precise devices. And a bit of historical context. One of the sort of major intellectual developments at the time was anatomy. And here I have sort of like a cutout from Andreas Vesalius' sort of text of a sort of a cross section of the brain. And that's sort of a lot of intellectuals in Europe and scientists were sort of unpacking and trying to figure out sort of how the body works as a kind of machine, as a kind of system. And that's sort of what's influencing Hobbes here. And Hobbes sort of, we see here a few chapters of sense. And I'm going to walk through sort of just the basic logic of how Hobbes thinks humans sort of behave. Again, it's very mechanistic. You have an object, like, okay, there's an apple, and then that object creates a sense in you. It goes, oh, there's an apple. That's sort of like the sense perception of the object. And then from that sense, you kind of have like a thought, or as Hobbes calls it, imagination. You go, I like apples, or I don't like apples, or I don't feel anything about apples. And then based on whatever this imagination is, you have a kind of motion or action. If you like apples, you move to the apple and you eat it. If you don't like apples, you're like, oh, go away. I don't want to eat apple. So again, very, very mechanistic, right? Cause and effect almost, just like, and almost, and again, this is almost deterministic. And again, I want to go back to Aristotle and contrast this with sort of just how, again, this was quite radical. Because again, notice, Hobbes begins with, again, what is unstated here is that this is an individual that Hobbes is talking about, just an individual person, right? And this is sort of how internally I, as an individual human being, sort of react to these things like apples. Aristotle's subject is very different because for Aristotle doesn't start with the individual. Aristotle starts with the political community, with the city-state. Human being is by nature a political animal. The city-state is prior in nature to each of us individually. He doesn't start with an individual. He starts with just the political community because, of course, we're human beings. Of course, we're social animals. Of course, we're going to form political communities. We're not. That's not even in question. So he starts with the political community, and Hobbes kind of turns that around on its head. He goes, no, we don't exist in a political community. We exist as individuals. And you can start to see why Hobbes is so central to sort of modern liberal political thought, because he starts from the individual. He, he starts at the individual level. Now Hobbes has to answer: why do states form? Why do communities form? If you exist as an individual who's just like, ooh, apple, I want apple, I don't want apple, how did you sort of come together to form a political community? Aristotle never has to ask this, or not in a way that's too sustained, because he's like, obviously we're in a village. Obviously we're in the state. So what is Hobbes' explanation of that. And this is one of the most famous passages in sort of Leviathan. And this is sort of Hobbes' thought experiment. Again, remember, he's sort of living in the shadow of the English Civil War and all this brutal conflict, and not just in England, but also over at in continental Europe, right? In France and 30 Years' War. And he says that nature has made us all equal. And again, this is sort of in line kind of with a lot of the Enlightenment stuff we've been talking about. We're all kind of equal. And so because we're all kind of equal, we all have a reasonable expectation that we can get what we want. And therefore, if both of us desire the same thing, which nevertheless we cannot both enjoy, we become enemies. Again, it's a bit nihilistic. It's a bit nihilistic. And again, let me sort of like put that in the same object sense motion that we articulated previously to just sort of walk through what Hobbes means. So now it's not just an apple. The object isn't just an apple. You also see someone else who wants the apple. So that's another object. And you realize that, oh, he wants the apple too. But I also want the apple. But he's standing in my way. We're both equal. I think I can kill him. So you try to kill him. And that's, for Hobbes, is the state of nature. For Hobbes, humans exist in this state where like we're all individuals and we all want each other's apples, or like durians, I guess, if you want to transpose this to our context. And because we are all kind of equal, we all just end up killing each other because we all want the same things, right? And here again, this is very explicit here. It is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war as is of every man against every man, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, in short. One of the most famous lines in sort of Leviathan. And again, and again, just to try to sympathize and understand where Hobbes is coming from, he was writing in the shadow of the English Civil War, and that's how he saw sort of everything that was happening. All of these people just wanted power. All of these people just sort of believed that their God was the best God, and so they just started killing each other because there was no common power to keep them all in awe. And that kind of hints at Hobbes' solution. We are all equal, so we're all like very competitive. We all just, if we want your thing, I'll get it. Like, screw you. That's Hobbes. So we need something above that. Something that can sort of just intimidate everyone from not killing each other. And so I just want to, there is sort of this almost caricatured vision almost that sort of prevails sometimes in neoliberal economics of people as hyper competitive and sort of like everyone's just utility maximizing. That Adam Smith, if you actually read Adam Smith, that's not exactly what he says. That actually sounds more like Hobbes. So again, I'm just trying to make a case of why Hobbes is so foundational. And so we need a common power. And that's how Leviathan, that's how the state, that's how the political community comes about. We want peace. We don't want to keep killing each other. We want to escape this perpetual violence. So we kind of need rules. I know we both want the apple. So let's agree that even if I want what you want, I'm not going to kill you. And you're not going to kill me. It's a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, if you think about it. But the problem is, of course, who's going to believe you? Who's going to listen to you? You'll shake your hands, you'll spit on each other's palms, and you'll be like, I won't kill you, you won't kill me. And then you'll wake up and he kills you. Who guarantees that? Who guarantees that that won't happen to you? And for Hobbes, that's going to be the state. That's Leviathan. That's the solution. The solution is all of you give up some of your right of governing, some of your right of being able to go, I want that, I can do whatever I want. You give up some of that. You give up some of your liberty. And everyone else agrees to do so. And where do you give that right to? You give that right to Leviathan, to the state, to the commonwealth, this mortal god to which we owe our peace and defense. And only then will we have peace, right? And because we've given this right to Leviathan, Leviathan can do whatever it wants. Leviathan has every right to sort of bind us all because it has to. It has to stand above us. If it doesn't stand above us, we're all just going to kill each other. Yeah, that's Hobbes. That's Hobbes. So that's sort of, and to go back to like the questions that sort of we framed at the beginning about emancipation, could you see Leviathan as an emancipatory state, as an emancipatory project, right? Where sort of you're all kind of giving up. It's because it's emancipating you from that brutal. Again, if you agree with Hobbes, to form Leviathan is to be freed from that state of perpetual warfare, from that brutish state of nature. And again, there are some passages in Leviathan where Hobbes kind of makes arguments along the lines of like, okay, someone might tell me, but I'm giving up some of my liberty. No, then I'm not free anymore. And Hobbes is like, well, yeah, kinda, but like if someone's gonna stab you at night when you're sleeping, you're not really free either. You're freer in this way. So it's kind of notice like sort of the justifications and sort of like the logics that this sort of line of thinking can take you. So that's Hobbes. And again, this is sort of just a highlight just for Hobbes. This is how much power, this is sort of how much coercive sort of legitimacy that you need to give to Leviathan. You cannot change the form of government. Here, like whatever the government does, whatever the sovereign, whatever Leviathan, whatever the state does, you cannot punish it. You cannot punish it. And this is another one where like, okay, Leviathan gets this legislative power. Leviathan, the state gets to make rules. He gets to be the judge and of making war and peace. But all of this is Leviathan's province. And if you say, well, that's unfair, that's just unfair because like, how does Leviathan have control over everything? And Hobbes' answer to that is like, well, you kind of agreed to this. That's Hobbes' answer. Hobbes' answer is that because we've all sort of gotten together and sort of given up some of our rights and agreed together to sort of form Leviathan, this is what you want. You can't take it back. And again, his language is striking. It's seeing every subject is author of the actions of his sovereign, right? Like you forming Leviathan. And so Hobbes is basically arguing here that Leviathan's actions, you decided them. You decided them. You are the author of these actions. And so when you try to punish Leviathan, you're trying to punish yourself, really. That's sort of Hobbes' logic. You are Leviathan. Leviathan is you. And that might feel a bit strange to you. Like, what? This is kind of too much. And there are critics eventually that will sort of like basically argue that, okay, Hobbes, you're being too much. But essentially, to try to sympathize with Hobbes and try to like really work within the logic of this framework, again, we need to pay very close attention to the language because again, it's striking. It's so striking. And it really gets at the heart of like what is, again, this seems like a very absolutist totalitarian project. But again, if you actually go down to the nitty-gritty, if you actually go into the language, this is the foundation of modern liberal politics, including representative democracy. And I'm going to show you how in a minute. So here are the subheadings of sort of like chapter 14 of Leviathan. And just read them. This is legalistic language. This is the way a lawyer would argue, right? What is a right? What does it mean to lay down a right? How do you transfer your right? What rights can't you transfer? What is a contract? What is a covenant? When do covenants become invalid? You cannot make covenants with animals. there's even one, you can't make a covenant with God. There's another one he made. And then how do you void a covenant? And then like which ones are valid and which ones are invalid? This is the language of a legalist of law. And that actually explains a lot about why Hobbes makes these arguments like, well, you asked for it. Because isn't that how a contract works in law? That's how Hobbes is thinking about this. You've consented. You've consented to this. And you've signed a contract. You've built the covenant. No takebacks. That's sort of the way Hobbes thinks about it. And this is the other key part. Like when you're trying to sign a legal argument, sometimes you'll have a representative, right? It's the same here. Hobbes portrays Leviathan as a representative. When you covenant and when you contract, when you agree to form Leviathan, whoever you designate as Leviathan has the right to be your representative. This is what I mean by modern liberal political thought. Consent, contract, rights, representation. This is all coming from Hobbes. And I think all of this becomes so much clearer when you ask, can you ever disobey Leviathan? And maybe surprisingly, unsurprisingly, Hobbes is like, yeah, there are times where you can. When? When Leviathan breaks the contract. So the contract you've basically formed with each other to form Leviathan is what? We're all going to keep killing each other. I don't want to die. So let's all agree to form Leviathan, and you can keep us all from dying. It's a right to live, basically. And if Leviathan fails to do that, you get to disobey it. What's one example he uses? For example, an enemy state captures you in war. You're a prisoner of war. Leviathan has no control over you anymore. Because Leviathan has breached the contract to sort of protect you. Again, he's an insane contractualist. And this puts modern constitutions into perspective, right? Because constitutions are written covenants. They're like almost like, and again, it's a chicken and egg problem. Like, did constitutions influence Hobbes, or did Hobbes sort of influence constitutions? I'm not too familiar with that history, but again, the link is striking, right? And that's why you have Mahkamah Konstitusi. This is sort of an institution that sort of kind of tries to interpret the covenant, the contract. And that's how you understand Hobbes. The bottom line, if you if you only want to take one thing from like everything we've been talking about Hobbes, it's this. It's about consensual representation. You've consented, and that's why you have a contract to form Leviathan, and Leviathan will therefore represent you. And that kind of explains now the picture. This is Leviathan. And Hobbes sort of own understanding, Leviathan is the king, is going to be the monarch. And that's why you have this guy with this sort of this crown. And then on the left, you have the sword. This is the violence that Leviathan gets to wield, because only with violence can you get people to stop killing each other. And on the right, you have the scepter, and this is sort of the spiritual domain, religious sort of like, and Hobbes says that like there should be a state religion, kind of, and sort of. So this is Leviathan, but notice what's inside Leviathan. It's like a bunch of people, and that's the representation that Hobbes is thinking about. It's not just the king. It's not just the state. It's not just Leviathan. It's Leviathan is all of you. You have come together. You have agreed to come together in this body called love, in this artificial man, to create Leviathan. And Leviathan represents you. Represents your what? Represents your agreement that we're all going to keep killing each other unless you step in and you keep us from doing that. Consent, covenant, represent. Those are the key terms. And so with Hobbes, what is the political community? What is the Commonwealth? It's the state. It would not exist without the state, because the state is the one thing that can monopolize, and this is sort of Weberian stuff, can monopolize coercion, can monopolize violence in such a way that it can bind you all together. That's Leviathan. And again, this all sounds very, very familiar, because again, on the surface, Hobbes sounds, this is not democratic, this is not liberal, it's not What is this? It is constitutional, though, and it is representative. And sort of the forms of a liberal democracy, liberal representative government that we're more familiar with, they come, the sort of the language that we're more familiar with have a lot to do with these people who sort of build on Hobbes' social contract theory. And for example, here you have Locke, and Locke is like kind of like a softer version of Hobbes, and he's like, "You're right, people are going to kill each other, but if you give all power to the Leviathan," and really, when you think about it, this is about how do you best maintain that contract, right? That covenant. What's stopping Leviathan from breaking that contract, right? Because now he has all the power. And so that's where Locke sort of like gets into these ideas that ultimately you still need universal consent. Whatever the system, whatever the institutions, you need that universal consent. That's Hobbes, and this is Locke. Montesquieu is more precise about what this means institutionally. The division of powers. Legislative, that's DPR for Indonesians, and the presidency, executive, and the judiciary, Mahkamah Agung, right? And so for Montesquieu, that's what you need to keep Leviathan from sort of abusing the contract. Because the person who's sort of the guardian of the contract can still abuse the contract. Well, who's really interesting is Rousseau. Rousseau is where it gets really, really interesting because Rousseau inverts the picture. With Hobbes and all the way to Locke, the state of nature is bad. Individuals are bad. They just kill each other. And Rousseau kind of inverts it. He's like, no, actually, it's not so bad. People are just having fun and like frolicking in the wilds, like this Garden of Eve-esque situation in the state of nature. The state of nature isn't the problem. The problem was civilization. It's civilization that came after that. It's private property. That's the problem. So how do we get back to that state of nature? How do we approximate that sort of original liberty that we had in the Garden of Eden, so to speak? And for Rousseau, it's still the state. It's still the Commonwealth. It's still Leviathan. But then the question changes. The question doesn't become, how do we make the state stop us from killing each other? How do we make the state approximate individual liberty? And that's where Rousseau starts thinking about concepts of a people, rakyat almost, right? When he talks about general will. How do we sort of capture a general popular will? And that's where this gets really democratic. That's Rousseau. And Rousseau is interesting because he's sort of like, and this is sort of a lot of like, when you think about, well, can legislative bodies truly represent a popular will, a general will? That's sort of Rousseau. But it's also in Rousseau where the logic of emancipation becomes the most stark. Because with Rousseau, he's very clearly saying that the ideal state, the ideal sort of commonwealth that we want is the one that sort of like gets us back to that state of liberty. It's very explicitly emancipatory. And then that's sort of like Hobbesian argument, but well, you kind of agree to this. That's even sharper in Rousseau. Because again, he takes a very Hobbesian turn too eventually, where he's like, okay, once you've sort of established the general will sort of gets control of the state, and the general will sort of gets to decide everything. And then someone inevitably would ask, well, that's too much. That's too much. That's excessive. I don't want that. And Rousseau is like, no, because you can't disagree with the general will, because the general will wants you to be free. And so being forced to obey to the general will is you being forced to be free. Again, just think about that language. Think about that language. There's this joke that like all governments which have the name democratic and people in them are not really. That's kind of Rousseauian, sort of, or at least like its excessive versions. So that's how much time do I have? Okay. So that's the West. That's contract theory. That's sort of liberalism. What does this apply to the post-colonial context? Because we've talked about consent here. There was no consent with colonialism. People in the Dutch East Indies did not get together and agree, hey, let's form Leviathan. That did not happen. It was imposed. The assumption underlying the Hobbesian contract breaks because it was imposed. There was never any consent. There was never any contract. And that continues. That doesn't end. And here Partha Chatterjee, who we'll be sort of engaging with, highlights this very starkly, because it wasn't just the moment of origin. This continued. This was the very structure of the colonial state, because the premise of its power was a rule of colonial difference. If Leviathan is supposed to is to be the representative of all of its sort of contractors, I guess, the colonial state didn't even intend to do that, because it's like, well, the natives are sort of below me, and that's you kind of like, you do, and like we're just not gonna care about you, or like, you're an underclass. It's not even trying to represent its colonial subjects, right? That colonial difference is the basis of its rule. And so just the entire premise of social contract theory in the liberal tradition just alters. And this, as we will increasingly see, presents a tension, because so much of our political language and our political institutions remain built around this. This is where it becomes central. So the person we're going to be thinking with about this is Partha Chatterjee. He's actually at Columbia. This is his big book, The Nation and Its Fragments. I didn't read it. I didn't have time. So I just read like one chapter from it. And really, he's pushing back against Benedict Anderson's argument that sort of like, you have this nationalist experience in the West, and then the rest of the world just imports it. And he's like, it's not that simple. There is again, because of the colonial difference part, it's not entirely the same. The post-colonial nation state has its own pathologies, and we have to take them seriously. That's what Chatterjee does. We'll focus on his essay, Whose Imagined Community? It sort of directly responds to that. So the gist of Chatterjee's argument is that we tend to think of nationalism as a contest, a directly political contest with the colonial state, Merdeka, right? And Merdeka is sort of like negara, the state, sort of like separates. Chatterjee argues it happened way before that. Happened way before that. And the way he understands it is he divides sort of colonial society into two different spheres. There's a material sphere and there's a spiritual sphere. And the material sphere is sort of, again, it's a domain where the West had proved its superiority and the East had succumbed. What? Like the economy. The Western economies are industrialized and superior. Western states are more, efficient, more modern. Science, technology, self-explanatory. And for Chatterjee, sort of, the nationalist elite kind of saw this domain and was like, okay, we're going to emulate you here, because you guys are kind of right. We want this. Where did they contest the colonial power? It's in the spiritual realm. And it's sort of like culture, essentially, right? And here we're like, we want an economy. We want like an economy like you, but we want it to be Indonesian. We want a state like yours, but we want it to be Indonesian. We want science like yours, but we want it to be Indonesian. And you kind of get the picture, right? And that's sort of, and once you look at it from this lens, the struggle for the nationalist struggle begins much earlier, before even the contest for the state. And Chatterjee uses the example of Bengal, but I think a lot of them are quite analogous to the Indonesian experience as well. So he talks about language, for example, and what's the material part of language. And here's sort of our theme of modernity, right? The specter returns again. Because you don't say, because again, think of the language. We want a modern state. We want a modern economy. We want modern science. And really, that corresponds to what Chatterjee calls the material here. And so for language, what does the material and what does a modern language look like? A printing press, publishing houses, newspapers, magazines, literary societies. What was the problem? The problem was that the colonial power controls all of this. We, as Bengalis, as Indians, as Indonesians, don't have this. And so we want to try to create our own version of this. That's the spiritual conquest. And of course, in Indonesia, the prototypical case of this Medan Priai, Tirto Adi Suryo sort of founds the first sort of native-run publishing house. Oh, newspaper, I guess, or the publishing house. And this was a whole network that was, that these movements tried to build. Happens in education too. Like, what is modern education? You have these networks of formal schools, you have a curriculum, you have like educational literature and syllabi. Again, the colonial power has that. Why don't we have our own? And you try to do that. What's in the Indonesian case? Taman Siswa, Ki Hajar Dewantara. So we have our analogies of this too. And eventually, and Chatterjee talks about more. He talks about art and literature is quite interesting too, because he talks about how the nationalist elite look at Western forms of art and literature that are deemed more modern, and then they try to nativize it. And what's interesting is that this leads to some interesting tensions between what native means and what modern means. And the thought experiment, perhaps that might make sense to Indonesians here, is think about, oh, what is modern theater? Shakespeare, Broadway. So you try to take that and you try to apply that to wayang. Try to think about what that might look like. It's because it's not going to be like, well, how do you sort of make that work? And those were sort of like the contradictions and the tensions that the nationalists faced. And eventually this happens in politics too. What does modern politics look like? You have parties, you have organizations, and eventually the state. You have a state. And and again, the struggle was making Indonesian versions of all of this. And the question that I really want us to sit with is why did this bifurcation between modern and between material and spiritual, and why was there such an emphasis on spiritual? And here I have a scene from Bumi Manusia, which sort of actually kind of captures a lot of these themes. And let's try to think and walk through the experience of the nationalist elite. People like, to a certain extent, maybe Minke, or it was Minke that was sort of portrayed by Pram in Bumi Manusia, or Sukarno, or Hatta, or Ki Hajar Dewantara. Let's try to think about their experience. These were highly, highly westernized individuals. They were educated in Dutch schools, and they knew sort of the premise of equality and of representation and of of rights, of the French Revolution. It comes up all the time in their writings. They knew all of this. And that's the material part almost. It's a modern part, sort of the equation. And they knew it enough that when they faced the Dutch colonial power, they could articulate what was missing from that on its own terms. Right? Like, for example, everyone is equal before the law, not if you're pribumi, not if you're non-white in the Dutch East Indies. The nationalist elite, though, was able to articulate this in these terms, in the terms of Western political thought, because they knew it enough. They knew it enough to see what was missing in that. And for them, what was missing was the spiritual. Right? Again, if you were Minke standing in front of the Dutch court, you know everything. You notice how the system works. You speak fluent Dutch. You know the principles of sort of like the law, of how it should treat you. You know all of that. And you see that it doesn't apply. Why? Because of a difference that was colonial and racial. Because you weren't white. Because you weren't Dutch. And this is how it gestates the nationalism. I am not of your race. I am not of your bangsa. I am not of your nation. And that's how the spiritual dimension emerges. To the nationalist elite, this was the thing that was like the biggest gulf, the biggest inconsistency in everything that they were brought up in. And that's why the nation becomes the subject of emancipation. We'll get into that in the next slide. But essentially, and the nation, and we talked about this in module 1, right? We talked about Sukarno and Indonesia, but the nation is presented as a primordial entity. Primordial in the sense that it has its own history and it predates the Dutch colonial system. We were there before you. We were there before you. And that's what a lot of nationalist myth making, right? And Sukarno's quotes here highlight that very sharply, right? Pancasila was what? Feelings that have dwelt for decades, hundreds and thousands of years. The people of Indonesia were always there. The nation was always, always there. And here he connects it to Sriwijaya, to Mataram, to Majapahit. Like, again, he's sketching this entire history that predates the colonial state. Right? And here, again, this is Gajah Mada in sort of the relief in Monas. Again, this is history that sort of predates all of this. It's primordial. And again, we'll get to like why emancipatory power eventually, but the one thing I want to really highlight first is that this is an inversion of Leviathan. It's almost the complete opposite. What is, again, Hobbes here? A people does not exist prior to the formation of a commonwealth because you're just a crowd of individuals. Only then do you agree to contract, you form Leviathan, you form a commonwealth, then you become a people. This is the complete opposite. The people have always been there. The nation has always been there. It's not sort of dependent on the state or anything. It's always been there. It's always been there. So it's a complete inversion of sort of the Hobbesian contractualist thinking. And what I want to argue is that this inversion is central, both to anti-colonial nationalism's emancipatory power, but also to all the maybe not all, but to a lot of the pathologies that you see today with the post-colonial nation state. Leviathan and the nation. These are the two, the state and the nation, or at least the state as it is built up on a Hobbesian logic. These are the two categories that we're going to have to engage with because they explain so much. So why is the nation so powerful in an emancipatory way? And here I want to turn us to the motive of the courtroom. A lot, again, Bumi Manusia is a classic example, right? Where, or again, it's just the courtroom appears so much in the nationalist imagination. Look at the Buru Quartet. Bumi Manusia, Minka and Nyai Ontosoro are dragged in front of the Dutch court to contest the case for Annelies. That's a central scene. And then later on in Anak Semua Bangsa, and because obviously the court isn't in their favor, in the next book, they create their own courtroom. They bring sort of the nephew who seized Annelies and they try him kind of informally. They accuse him informally in the veranda of Nyai Ontosoro's estate. So much of the key political texts of the Indonesian National Revolution were defense cases, in court. Indonesia Selatan, this is Indonesia Menggugat, that's a defense case. Indonesia Vrij, that's his defense speech in the Netherlands. The court is a very interesting site because the courtroom is where you see the logic of the social contract explicitly at work. Think about Hobbes again, his language of contracts and rights. Where does that apply most? It's in the courtroom. These are your rights. This is the law. Follow the law, and then you argue your case based on that. But if you're Minka, if you're Ontosoro, if you're Sukarno, none of that matters. You've mastered the law. You've mastered the social contract. You know exactly what it says. It doesn't matter because you're not Dutch. And that's where Indonesia Menggugat, I think, becomes a central text here because Sukarno refuses to play by the rules. I know I'm not going to win, but I don't have to win because you're not trying me. Your laws, your contract applies to me, but you're not trying me. You're trying Indonesia. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about your courtroom because it exists before. It exists before your contract. It exists before your laws. It's a primordial entity with its own history. You can stop it. You can't stop it. It is beyond all of your logic. And that's why nationalism had so much emancipatory power. Because it steps outside the logic of the contract, the logic of liberal thought that undergirded so much of the colonial project. It steps completely outside of it. It says, this is above you. This is beyond you. It's almost like a divine intervention if you think about it. And so that's why this inversion is crucial. So that's the emancipatory part. What about the pathologies? Why? So, okay, that's sort of that that did something that worked for a while. What now? How does this legacy live on with us? And Chatterjee goes about this, and there is a very crude reading of Chatterjee that goes like, well, obviously this is bad because the state was like a Western import, and then that's not that's a very crass reading. I don't think that's what Chatterjee was going for. Um, what he's going for was, I think, a bit more subtle, and it worked on several levels. And the first was the a version of the argument that Spivak highlighted. Was this project only truly emancipatory for a certain elite? Right? Because so much of the way that this was sort of thought of was through that combination of like racial and colonial difference, but also at the same time, like the aspiration of Western modernity, right? And that works, that makes sense for the class of people who went to Dutch schools, who knew about the French Revolution, who would, who like when you talk about the social contract or about representation and all that, they'd be like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. Or you're all equal before the law. These are people who've been steeped in that sort of tradition and logic. And so that's sort of a version of the subaltern studies, which was a collective of historians that started in South Asia, that they argued that nationalism was a sort of, in many ways, it was a project of an elite, and that there were big chunks of the subaltern that didn't really, like sort of, that for whom this was less relevant. But that's also, I think the story is also a bit more complicated than that. And I think the person to turn for this is Benedict Anderson and his history of Java during the early years of the Indonesian Revolution, where he shows that not really, because nationalism also had immense popular appeal. But that this wasn't the only kind of we've been talking about one kind of nationalism here, but there were multiple kinds. There was a popular kind. There was like and Anderson highlights this beautifully through the struggle between Sultan Syahrir and sort of a lot of the nationalist elite and Tan Malaka in his Persatuan Perjuangan, where it's sort of like he almost like pits this like there's a more almost this like bureaucratic, diplomatic version of nationalism and a sort of more like rough and tumble populist nationalism that was represented by Tan Malaka. So that complicates the picture a bit, I think, where nationalism, yes, maybe it was articulated very strongly by this class, but once you let the cat out of the bag, it's actually quite open for grabs. Like popular elements could sort of like contest it as well. So that's Anderson. But I think the deeper sort of pathology, and Chatterjee identifies this too, is again the tension between Leviathan, which is like the sort of this whole system of thinking, of commonwealths, of contracts, of covenants, of representation, and the nation as articulated by people like Sukarno. And really, this is not just Sukarno, but really the entire post-colonial world. And Chatterjee here, I think, is very revealing, right? Here lies the root of our post-colonial misery, not in our inability to think out new forms of the modern community. We do that. We already know how to do that. When we look at when you sort of look at indigenous societies, maybe even when you sort of think or imagine things in a more transnational context, when you try to think as Marx did in terms of class, that's you are thinking out new forms of the modern community. That's not the problem. The problem is our surrender to the old forms of the modern state, Leviathan. Leviathan is in tension with so much, and not Leviathan, but sort of in the post-colonial. Let me rephrase that. In the post-colonial world, our ideas of the state are built on this weird shotgun marriage between Leviathan and Sukarno's primordial nation. And why does that? And I haven't really quite figured this out either. So this is just me thinking out loud with you guys, honestly. But let's try to think about why that is the case. So much of Indonesia's, and really the post-colonial world, especially if if they're more outwardly democratic and representative, are built on a Hobbesian logic, right? You have the language of rights, you have constitution, you have the division of powers, you have a representative body like DPR, but the animating spirit is the spirit of the nation, of a people. And where does this break down? Again, what was so central in the Hobbesian logic? Consent. You consent and you contract. Do you ever consent to be part of a nation? You do not consent to be part. You're just born into it. You are Indonesian or you're not. There's no consent here. You don't have a choice. So that part of the equation already breaks down. There's no consent. There's no contract. People did not gather together in a room, or at least if you are working through the logic of nationalists like Sukarno, and you present the nation as this primordial entity, that's not how you're thinking about it. You're not getting together in a room and sort of like covenanting to be a nation. It's always there. So consent breaks down. And then representation also gets tricky, because how do you even represent a nation? And again, think about that. Representing an individual is one thing. How do you represent a nation? And let me just try to highlight that through an example. On the left here is something that's closer to Hobbesian logic, which is sort of like you're trying to represent the inhabitants of an area, Central and East Java, right? And again, the bureaucratic sort of, the legalist is sort of intentional here. And when this is sort of the framework you're thinking about, the focus is almost institutional. You educate people about their rights, and you make sure they go vote. You're like, you can vote, these are your rights. Make sure elections are not rigged. Elections make sense. Elections are proper. And then once you form legislative bodies, they actually represent the will of this consensus. Or even more important, as important, representative bodies are spaces where the representatives can actually debate and form a consensus. Again, this is very Hobbesian, right? And then once you have the state represents this consensus. A consensus that was reached through elections and then legislative bodies, and that's represented by the state. And that's why when the state acts with its full power, with its full coercive force, it represents this consensus of individuals. But if you're thinking like Sukarno, you're not representing inhabitants of an administrative location. You're representing Java. Java, this primordial entity. You're Javanese or you're not. And here the focus changes. It changes. It's not institutional anymore. It's about articulation. What is Java? What is a Javanese person, really? And then and you have the whole shebang. Maybe, well, if you are Javanese, you speak Javanese. You practice certain customs. You know how to sungam, maybe. I don't know. Just being very stereotypical here. You're polite. You're from Central Java. You have a certain kind of ancestry that's rooted in this land. It's very different. It's a very different way of thinking about representation. And I would argue that what happens here isn't really representation, it's expressing. The state doesn't represent anymore because you've identified. You've identified the nation. You've identified Java. And then if Java is this thing, it has a will. It has an intention. And then you're simply expressing it. And that works for Indonesia too, right? You're not just representing, if you're a nationalist in the Sukarnoist vein, you're not just representing inhabitants in an institutional way. You're expressing the will of the nation. What does Indonesia want? Indonesia has this history. Indonesia doesn't want to be colonized. Indonesia doesn't want to be conquered. Indonesians love rice. They want economic security. They don't want economic independence. They hate the West or whatever. And then you express that will. And I think this explains something that's so central to anti-colonial nationalism, and it's the figure of the nationalist leader. People and again, look at the language, penyambung lidah rakyat Indonesia. Lidah rakyat, right? It's the voice of the people. Not the elected representative, the voice of the people. Sukarno's power didn't come from the fact that he was winning elections. And that's why I think in some sense, it is a bit, it's if you rigged elections are a thing, but I don't think that's where a lot of the power of this is coming from. It's from being able to articulate. It's from being able to present yourself as an embodiment of the nation, of its will. And this is why the stakes are so high. Because anybody, any organization, any body, any majoritarian ethnic group, this is what happened in Burma, any religious group, any single person, authoritarian figure, totalitarian, whoever, once that person can seize this ground and claim that they are embodying the nation, that they are acting in the will of the nation, they get Leviathan. They get the state. They can do whatever they want with it. They gain legitimacy. That's why all of these arguments about democratic backsliding, you've disrespected elections, you're not listening to the rule of the law. Why, in a lot of these extreme cases, they lose because of this power, because of sort of this nationalist force. What does that matter? I know this is what Indonesians want. I don't know what you're saying. They want independence. They want pembangunan. They want, you're speaking for the nation. And the point isn't to say that the Hobbes, like that, the Hobbesian logic is outdated. Or that's not the point. The point is that people think in that framework a lot, but that's not enough. You have to treat this seriously. Only then can you really, really diagnose what's going on in post-colonial societies. And I would also further argue that this is not limited to post-colonial societies. Notice the West, notice the global North, and notice how a lot of the political establishment and the intelligentsia too, they're baffled. They're baffled with the resurgence of right-wing nationalism. They don't know why it keeps growing. They don't know why their institutions don't work, because they operate on a logic that defies your Hobbesian foundation. And you have to engage with it on its own terms. Otherwise, it looks inexplicable. And I think that's the tension. I think that's the tension. Chatterjee kind of talks about it too, when he sort of like looks at representative bodies, and he looks at like how, well, he was using like a more like colloquial example of like nationalist elites sort of simulating a representative body in a cafeteria. And again, the language was very Hobbesian, right? It's sort of like, oh, you have a democratic, you have like a democratic chamber, you have a lower house, you have an upper house, you sort of argue, and then the representative says something. But what was the decision being made? Whether to accede to the Hindu majority or the non-Hindu minority. And that's the language of the people. It's a language of Hindus, Muslims. And in the Indonesian case, it's the language of Japanese, Sundanese. It's like you're applying these Hobbesian logics of individuals consenting to primordial peoples and nations. And I think that's sort of where a lot of these tensions come about. So that's the gist of it, really. And sorry if that ended in a relatively unclean way. Again, this is literally just me thinking out loud. So that's sort of where I will leave off for the most part. And again, we'll have a discussion session at the end. But before we get that, some logistical bookkeeping stuff. Again, we've talked a lot about these two concepts, right? Hobbesian state and sort of this nation. I think so much of why this problem feels inexplicable is because we talk about these categories, state, nation, as if they're timeless things. Like you open like a text in like sociology or economics or like political theory, and they're like, here's the state, here's the nation, as if they've always existed. Where did the history go? These things have their own histories, right? And again, that's part of like a lot of what we're seeing here comes down to the fact that you take this Hobbesian concept that's rooted in a very specific European experience, and then you're just applying it somehow to a context with its own history. And sometimes that's creative, sometimes that ends up with weird contradictions and tensions. But none of these come to the surface if you don't talk about the history. And so that's really the question we're left with is why and how do these histories disappear, right? And they disappear more when they're in certain parts of the world. And this is what we were talking about in the beginning. When we were talking about like why are we back in Europe, where when you're talking about Adam Smith, very clearly, oh, I'm talking about economics. But if you're talking about Hatta, you're like, I'm talking about Indonesian economics. Why does the English disappear when you talk about Adam Smith? And that's sort of what we're going to be talking about in our next session, which I think will actually, for the most part, wrap up the first third of module 3. But that's going to happen in 4 weeks because we have a lot of guest speakers in the next 3 weeks. So next week, we've already posted this in the group, but Sophie Chow is coming to UI. We're helping UI organize this event. She's going to be talking about her new book on sort of West Papuan theories of hunger and just about multi-species sort of relationality. And what does that, and really the urgency of that amidst growing extractivism and sort of certain forms of economic development. So that's next week. And then in the 2 weeks after that, we have 2 other guest speakers. First, we have Hilmar Farid. And Pak Hilmar, his sort of, a lot of his work, I first encountered his work, the first through his dissertation, where he engaged with a lot of the topics that we've been talking about today. And really the central figure here is Pramudia Anantatur, where Pram is sort of like also grappling with sort of this idea of a nation, where we've been talking about how the nation is presented in the Sukarnoist vision as sort of this primordial thing. And Pram sees that. Pram feels the power of that. And he's behind the nationalist project 100%. But he also sees the dangers of this, what Hilmar calls fetishized history very early on. And so he tries to sort of think through and develop sort of an alternative way of understanding the nation. So that goes a lot into what we've been talking about today. And then the week after, here we have LB, and LB will be giving a talk on, and so LB was one of the few people who responded to our call for like, if anyone wants to present on decolonizing knowledge, please reach out. LB, reach out. Thank you, LB. So he'll be talking about decolonizing English, the English education, by decentering sort of like the typical canonical texts and sort of that we usually read, and centering it in, I think it's sort of local practices in Sunda, local Sundanese practice. I might be wrong, but more details on all of these. But we have a pretty stacked schedule for the next 3 weeks, and then eventually we'll get back to our final sort of scheduled curriculum session. And then, yeah, so that's it for today. I'm going to leave it here on the questions I raised all the way in the very beginning, with the addition of one more, because we've been talking about this the whole time. It's the nation. Does the nation still need emancipation? And since we've been talking about lidah rakyat and expressing the will of the nation, who gets to speak for it? Thank you. I'm going to open it up. Just a bit of a logistical thing. If I turn on the speaker while the mic is on, there will be a lot of echoing. So if anyone on Zoom wants to speak directly, just raise your hand and I'll do my little thing and you can talk and everyone can hear you. Thank you. Let me open it up for Q&A. I think there's some, in the meantime, let me switch the screen share and just read through some of the questions or some of the comments in the chat. But yeah, anyone in person, anyone over Zoom wants to comment, feel free. Okay, so the chat should be visible now. Anyone want to? It's okay. I'll just read out the chats then. Okay, this is Zaki Arif. Well, I think Hobbes said that the nature of man is that of Homo homini lupus, a wolf to another human, totally different from Indonesian universal definition of human, as human are not an object to the self, but something. But let me read this and then I'll. But something like of a kin, that they're one and the same, of a kind. Pardon me for the lack of more comprehensive terms. Yes, yes, about the hops part. That's true. And for the Indonesian Universal Man, I'm hesitant to comment too much on this because I'm not very familiar with Indonesian sort of like, let's call it Indonesian thought before the 1900s. I don't know if Alf is lurking somewhere in there. Maybe Alf can answer this better if he's somewhere in there. But yeah, I think Revin raised his hand. Let me do a little bit of something. Uh, 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 okay, that's what I meant. So, Revin, I am going to mute myself and turn on the speaker at exactly the same time. One, two, three.
Hi, thank you, Derek, for the presentations. Very interesting. Hope you can hear me, even though I'm outside, so it's probably a bit noisy. I want to ask a question about. So the background is that I think 3 years ago, my lecturer in Sussex asked me a question about, does Indonesia have something like original political theory in the themes of Hobbes, in the themes of Rousseau and John Locke, something about state of nature and how state is a necessity. Do you have any reference to, whether any Indonesian thinker theorize something about that? Because I think that as a post-colonial state and as what was a colonial state, most thinkers they try to dismantle this Hobbesian hegemony of the theory of state, and by extension also John Locke and maybe to a certain extent Rousseau. But I haven't been able to answer his question for years. So yeah, it's just the question. Do you know if there is a kind of a more systematic political theory for from an Indonesian thinker, or maybe in Southeast Asia, that seeks to answer the state of nature and why and how states should exist? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Revin. Unfortunately, I am going to have to extend like your period of not knowing how to answer that question because again, like what I just, and this applies to like Zaki's comment too. I am just not the most familiar with sort of the pre-colonial period, I guess, when it comes to sort of both history, but also in terms of culture and thought. And even like the examples I put of like Pararaton and Hikayat Hang Tua, I was sort of just cross-referencing them through a friend. Alf, are you in there? Maybe Alf can answer. So I unfortunately can't give you more on this, unfortunately. I will say though, it's more a comment than anything else. I think well these sort of comparative exercises are helpful, I think, to a certain extent, and I think they're worth asking. I think one limitation of them is that they still take sort of they still take the Western experience as a frame of reference, which is not invalid at all. But I think sometimes the risk that happens is like you're like, okay, is there a version of the social contract in Indonesia, and that, or like in pre-Indonesia, I don't even know how to call that period. But the risk of that is sort of like you're trying to look for the social contract in Indonesia, which like it's like it by doing that you're already not treating the thought that's emerging from this sort of region of the world on its own terms. So that sort of comparative exercise is important, but I think it's also interesting to sort of just think about. Like I had this conversation with Auf and Brian too at some point where it's like, yeah, Indonesians didn't really have philosophers before Muhammad Nasrun, but we're really only thinking in those terms because we're defining philosophy by a very Western European experience, right? Could hikayat be a kind of philosophical work? Could babats be philosophical works? And so those are the sort of interesting questions that start opening up once you try to sort of like go around that framework. But that's just a comment from me. I again, sorry. Alf raised his hand, so maybe I should just. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing. Alf, mute, unmute, and unmute at the same time. One, two, three.
Hello, hello. Okay. Yeah. I assume you guys can hear me. First, yeah. Thank you for your lecture. This is the first time I fully understand what is social contract is and the whole hopes concepts. So I don't actually understand the question about consciousness since it's kind of philosophical and I'm not a philosophy guy. But if the question refers to how we perceive ourselves in the past, in the pre-colonial times, uh yeah especially in the Malay world, the concept of society is merely exist. I mean, we don't have some kind of Leviathan where people like are coming together as one nation, as one people, since the we the we itself is wasn't exist. So most people like us, the commoners, we perceive ourselves like me. I see myself as Malayu people um because I'm the subject of some sort of rulers. So yeah, I'm the rakyat of this polity of Johor kingdom or Aceh kingdom. So we look at ourselves as a subject of of a state of a polity, and this goes to the way we perceive space too. That's why the term Indonesia or even Nusantara, or actually there's no single term to define our region, since we don't see our region in geographical terms. So if you look into old manuscripts, maybe you cannot find a single map of a kingdom, because people claim their territory. The kings and rulers claim their territory by blood, so by ancestry. So that's why if you look into old manuscript, probably you will find a lot of um genealogy. So it's like silsila, they call it. And yeah, that's the way we see ourselves. So is it Indonesia? Indonesia is is a term coined by um biologist, by geographer, by who the name I forgot, the British guy. And then we have Insulanda, and then most of the terms are coined by Westerners to understand the geographical aspect of our region. But our ancestor, they don't really see ourselves as so the concept nation is very vague and obscure. And that's why, yeah, the social contract that you explained earlier is that's the concept that adhered mostly by those who studied in the West. I mean, like Sukarno and those, those guys. They study in the Dutch. But how about the subaltern? Yeah, they don't really see themselves as a nation. So yeah, I think that's the easiest way I can explain about that. And by the way, this is also the discussion that Derek also mentioned before about about how Derek wants to put the we concept between the West and Indonesian or Nusantara people. I mean, with Hang Tuah. Hang Tuah used to be some kind of propaganda by the polities, by the sultans, to show this is the ideal human being. So the ideal human being is not universal man who has these stances in politics. No, but it's those who best servant. So most of us see ourselves as in 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 a very hierarchical thought, not in we are all equal. So it's a new concept, and yeah, I think I think that's all. So thank you, Derek. Um, yeah, thank you. I finally understand what Hope's ideas and stuff. So yeah.
Thank you, Alf. Just before I get back to Revin, because I realize we've been using the term a lot without defining it, and it is subaltern. And some people, it's commonly misunderstood that subaltern refers to the oppressed. It doesn't. It's a much more specific term, and it was coined by Antonio Gramsci, who's a Marxist. And so, just a bit of background: Marxist categories, at least at the time, were very much like there were very set like class categories. If you were Marxist, like there's the proletariat, you had the bourgeois slash capitalist, blah blah blah, and they sort of corresponded to like very specific sort of material relationships. And then Gramsci looks at the south of Italy and he looks at the peasants and they're like, the Marxists don't have a language for this. They're not really proletarian, but they're not really capitalist either. And he was sort of like, what are they? And this was the term that gets appropriated by subaltern studies again. And really, what it really is getting to is like a group that is kind of illegible. You don't really have a language to describe them. And then even when they speak, the whatever they say is always distorted because the language that they sort of use is sort of and the concepts that they use are so completely outside the language of like dominant epistemic structures that people don't really understand them. So for example, maybe one example that I can think of is maybe like, you have a certain masyarakat adat and then they have their own practices. And then you're like, and this is actually a story that we've heard. Um, I think it's like I forgot where exactly. It could be a bunch of islands in Maluku where a lot of their sort of deepest traditions were expressed to bodily movement, dance. And then you look at that and you're like, I don't get it. Why is it so important? They're like, of course you don't, because you don't dance like us. And you're like, okay, explain it to me. But the moment you ask them to explain it to you, it changes. It's distorted, right? Because the practice of dancing is not something that, you're not doing it. You're not sort of engaging in that sort of activity. So you can never really know sort of what it really means and feels. And the moment you try to like translate into a version that is legible to you, it sort of you lose the original thing. So that's kind of an example of subalternity. But let me get back to Revin. Do you wanna did we answer your question? Is there anything you wanna comment or anything again? Just raise your hand like if you wanna say something, or you can just pop off in the chat. No? Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Okay, let's go on with the chat. Okay, Abel's comment, consider also the Christological dimension, the head and body of Christ, which has been interpreted in Protestant representationist terms, which I think has influenced Hobbes too. Thank you. I didn't really notice that, but that's an interesting point. I will try to think more about that. There's the thing about Hobbes that he's so like it's biblical imagery is just everywhere, and it's almost like he's trying to supplant it with this all artificial man, but he's also trying to appropriate it. And it's like it's weird and it's interesting. Okay, Robertus Pradata. I don't. Sorry, I did that. The argument that the Leviathan is the macrocosm of our political, economic, and social will is very intriguing to me, particularly because it questions history. Does consent really exist when babies born inside of a polity are not able to choose whether they want to be of the nationality within that polity that is already in place from historical processes? Yes. Is it really fair to say this is what you wanted when the institutions and structures of power were created in the historical inception of political theories, when it is us that's unwittingly put in this position? Just some thoughts. No, you raise a very important point. The nation is sort of one sort of way to like get around this from a post-colonial context. But even within Europe and within its own traditions of political theory, this is a question that like comes up a lot. I remember I took a class on sort of political theory, and then when we ended up talking about Hobbes, this was the question that sort of came up all the time. So again, even within sort of just a Western sort of educational context, this comes up all the time. So, Muhammad Chandra Wijayakusuma. Can a state claim legitimacy if its original foundation was built through? Yeah, this is exactly what we were talking about. Zaki Arif. So in order to replace or make a totally alternative structure of power that can be imagined, we have to alter our perceptions towards universal definition of man first, how they perceive objects and other human subjects. It's making sense. The Leviathan are actually us. We let the monster live inside each of us. Robertus, would it not make sense that the Leviathan is the creation of the state itself, the historical product of events, agreements, motions that have befallen our forefathers, and creation of their imagined political community? I mean, what is the nature of the state? Where they come from, if not from people itself? Not trying to decouple the idea of a community in order to make the idea of antagonist more vivid in our story. Maybe it's within us, within our consciousness, that prefers simplicity from modernity instead of long process boringness of traditions. Okay, last one. I think Leviathan exists within us. Oh, Putra wants to. Okay, Putra raised his hand. Okay, I'm going to do the usual thing. Okay, 1, 2. Wait, sorry. 1, 2, 3.
Go on.
I think you're still mute. I think you're still muted if you're talking. Sorry, I can't. Maybe I should put this up. Okay, let's try this again.
Hello?
Putra. Okay.
Yep.
1, 2, 3.
Hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. This fits my curiosity of an Indonesian living in Aceh. So pretty much I've observed what happens in Papua and in other peripheral regions in Indonesia. So I try to reflect that the concept of nationalism, unity in diversity, born out of colonial experience that we used to have in the past, and from which the birth of the modern country started in Indonesia. And the concept of modern state pretty much refers to the West as a model. Do you think in this replication, it also consequently adopted colonial elements in it? So we can look at what's happening in Papua right now, for example, or what happened in Aceh in the past. And also, I have a question. To what extent Hobbes' concept of man has affected epistemic violence in the colonized countries? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I hope it's clear enough. Yeah.
Yes, that's got it. Thank you. Okay, that's a It's a very rich question. Let me try to think about. Let me try to like so. So the first level of your question is, did did we as a society unknowingly sort of imbibe a lot of like colonial elements? And I think the answer is sort of, I think the answer is yes. um, sort of the state itself. I mean, that's part of like that's a lot of what we were talking about, where the sort of and I think I'm gonna try to weave in some of the points that Zaki and Robertus raise here in their discussion, because I think this is quite relevant. Which and it's again it's a chicken and egg argument. Is the state come first, the community come first, um, and the state as we've been sort of seeing here, the state. This is an element that maybe Alcia, I don't think Alcia is in here today, but she'll probably raise this topic more in the next segments. Like the I don't know how to define like the second third of module 3. She's gonna be talking about Islam, and we've been seeing this with Hobbes. I'm not a Hobbes expert, so I don't want to be definitive about this, but the sense I'm getting is that Hobbes he's like overthrowing God almost. He's trying to overthrow divine law as a kind of sort of starting point for communities. And here it's a very specific God, right? It's the Christian God. And he's trying to replace it with his artificial man. And in some weird way, if you really think about it, the nation is kind of like almost like an eschatological substitute for that, right? Sort of a secular theology, maybe. I don't know. It's something that's sort of that's come up quite a bit. But where it gets to your part about decolonization, does that apply to a lot of how a lot of communities in Indonesia actually see the world? So aside from everything we've been talking about today, which is sort of like this, and we'll get to that with what you said with the Hobbesian man, there are many communities, especially like komunitas adat, where their views of sort of like community and nature and sort of existence are just so intimately cosmological that sort of this overthrow, this sort of like secular insertion might just not make sense to them. And they're there in that sense. It's already a kind of a colonial violence, right? And really a lot of sort of like, and that sort of goes into like a lot of the deeper questions about the state. Again, the state was, and this is sort of I think part of the debate, the discussion between Zaki and Robertus. And what I've recently noticed is that if you look at a lot of the foundational texts of Western social theory, and I'm thinking here Marx and Weber, they don't talk about the nation that much. They don't even say the nation state, but they talk about the state a lot. The state is almost foundational, and so it's almost like. And I was having this discussion recently with I forgot who a friend, where the way in which nation and state are entangled and disentangled is very different between the West and I don't want to generalize across the whole post-colonial world. So let's say Indonesia, and you can see a lot of that in the wording. How do we call it in the West? It's the nation state. Two concepts, nation state. So they're separable, and you've welded them together. What is the word we have? Negara. And in Negara, it's not clear where one ends and the other begins. And I think that's an interesting observation, where sort of like this sort of distinction between community, state, and sort of like is state formation a historical thing? Is like it's sort of it doesn't necessarily map entirely to us, which goes into your sort of colonial sort of baggage. The other thing that's interesting is again everything that we've been talking about with the Hobbesian tradition, Locke, is sort of premised on the concept of society, which is also something that the word society itself was something that blew up in 17th century Europe. So it's weird to think about because society is such a like a embedded word today, but it's sort of again it's historical too. And that sort of explains a lot of like the contractualism of Hobbes, right? It's called the social contract. And I was asking Alf, do we have a word for? We don't have the closest word we have to society in Indonesia is masyarakat. But masyarakat itself, its roots come from the Arabic, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's masirik, which means like it's like an agreement or something. Again, correct me. I might be misremembering our conversation. But again, it gets back to that, like we borrowed a word for like consent from Arabic, and then that became our word for society, kind of. So it kind of gets back to sort of a lot of these um, debates about kind of like where one ends and where the other begins. I don't think it's very clear. That's part of what Chatterjee was getting at, right? We need a language that can talk about these two things at the same time, not just nation and state separate, but negara, these like almost like if you look at Hobbes, so much of Hobbes, he's like, how does the state form? Like Hobbes, one way of reading Leviathan is it's a book that tries to explain the formation of the state. The book and the text to compare it to is Indonesia Menggugat, because Indonesia Menggugat is not a theory about how the state is formed. It's a theory about how the nation is formed. It's a Bildungsroman. It's almost a biography of Indonesia, of its journey from Dutch colonialism, and so also so on and so forth, and how it emerges as a nation. And then he kind of tucks in, like, kind of nervously at the end, and therefore we need a national state. Because obviously we're a nation, and obviously the nation needs a state. That assumption is also interesting, right? To sort of interrogate a bit further. And so, again, a lot of these inversions between like the Western political tradition and sort of what we actually see going on in Indonesian political history are not really the same, and we should stop treating them as the same. Hobbesian man. Yes, this is sort of like, and we if you're interested, the class we talked about, our most recent class where we talked about Spivak, the title was I Doubt, Therefore I Am. We compared like Descartes, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Spivak talk exactly about this. And that's the gist of Spivak's point. The way in which we think about subject, right, as an I who thinks and reasons and desires, is itself very much rooted in a specific Western experience and history. And you're right to point that out, because that doesn't always hold in a lot of Indonesian contexts. And again, I think if you're sort of like experience of subject is something that's more communitarian or cosmological, or something that's intertwined with nature, where you sort of, that just doesn't hold. And you're absolutely right to sort of point that out as sort of like a kind of epistemic violence, because we've just assumed that, and we've built our most powerful coercive institutions around that assumption. Does that answer the question? Sorry, I think I rambled a bit too much. Let me just do you can put it up an emoji, you can do a thumbs up, or you can like raise your hand if you want to talk more. Oh, Alf, yeah, Musirak. Are we good, Putra?
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to discern, but yeah, it's a good point that you. I think I really need to reread some part of your earlier explanation. But yeah, there's a I already assume about this concept of epistemic violence, especially what we see, what's happening in the indigenous people, and how this modern curriculum in education, for example, like try to, put the indigenous knowledge away, and it's not included in our curriculum, and how it shapes our mind, how we see the nature, and it's very related. But thank you very much. Because there was also a critique that I read about Indonesia, like did Asia Africa conference, and there was a critic that the critic of Asia Africa conference is it replicate the Western models. So that's why it makes me think that what's happening right now in Papua is like kind of replication of what happened in the past. So yeah, but thank you very much. This is a very thought-provoking, and now I feel I have, some sort of new insight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Putra. So I realize that it's 12:20 here, so I'm just gonna try to rush through all of these. I'm sorry if that if that means you kind of get skipped over here. Padilla, if the object affecting the sense, motion, and imagination, does that raise an awareness yeah, this is precisely what we were talking about with Putra's question about Hobbesian man, right? Is this sort of phenomenological experience of subjectivity universal? Okay, I'm gonna, sorry. Oh, thank you, Abel. Okay, this is let me read this from Robertus. I think the somewhat homogenizing nature of the Hobbesian Leviathan as a state that represents and mandates national consent is what is causing this issue for a nation as diverse and big as Indonesia. Can a central state or even a single man for that matter represent the will of 250 million people? Surely not, since a person is not the accumulation of those millions of people. What other forms of representations exist then that is more decentralized and more communities based? I love how it's all presented. Thank you. Yes, and I think you raised an exact point. And that's on sort of like the institutional, and there's several levels where this can take, right? There's the institutional level, which is sort of like almost like the centralism versus regionalism debate in Sukarno and Hatta, Soit PRRI, Permesta. But I think there's also the more, and I think this is where you can do a lot of interesting work, which is at the conceptual and the imaginary level, where it's sort of like you try to think about where again, it's not the institutions that you're trying to think through, but it's these concepts, it's these ideas of belonging and what that does with the state in conjunction with the state. Yeah, that's again Chatterjee's. Like we've done a lot of the reimagining in terms of the community, but we haven't really done it in a way that reckons with how we assume the state is, right? And here is where the Leviathan versus the nation framing, I think, might come in handy, right? There's like the origins of the state in a Leviathan, in a Leviathanic sense. There's also origins of the state in sort of a Sukarnoist nationalist sense. And I think those are, we need to distinguish between them a bit more. But thank you for the comment, Robertus. Okay, Pradipa, thank you for the intriguing talk. Do you mind elaborating more on the far right part? Yeah, sorry if I misunderstand here, but is the implication that anti-colonial nationalism and European far right share a similar historical imagination? I am under the impression that far right works on the logic of exclusion, and while anti-colonial nationalism seems to be all-encompassing and subsuming. Thank you. Yes, I thank you for this question. I've been thinking about this a lot. So a few things. You're absolutely right to sort of hit on this distinction, because so much of, at least in the West, a lot of the way nationalism is framed is, and that's really, I mean, and I think in many ways it's true, that's how it's been manifesting in a lot of Western societies, is as a right-wing phenomenon. It's based on, as you said, exclusion. It's a lot of it's like quite nativistic. And there's a weird reluctance to sort of engage, and I think a lot of this leads, understandably, to a reluctance to engage directly with the concept of nationalism. And I think, I think we're starting to see a shift, but I think where this gets very revealing is when a lot of the discourse in the West about this phenomena comes up. They don't start with nationalism; they start with polarization, which is telling. You know, it's not like they're nationalists. No, they're just polarized. they're just like too far apart. But again, your point is right, because I think in a lot of this discourse and the focus on right-wing nationalism that's emerged, a lot of people forget that nationalism also did not have to be right-wing. And that's sort of what you see with anti-colonial nationalism. And you're absolutely right to sort of identify kind of like that distinction. Where this gets really interesting is that if you want to call anti-colonial nationalism left-wing nationalism, well, let's do that just to make things simple. You have left-wing nationalism, you have right-wing nationalism. They seem ideologically very far apart. What gets interesting, though, is that there are deep structural similarities. A lot of the surge in right-wing nationalism that you see today in the West is in some ways a response to economic factors. They're taking away our jobs. It's a response to the predations of global capitalism, to industrialization, to outsourcing, and to all of this. And what's interesting about Indonesia Menggugat is that it's framed in not exactly, but in a very similar way. The nation is presented as a vaccine against sort of this global imperialist capitalist system. And so that that's interesting because there's a common genealogy here. There's a common concern here where the nation is sort of mobilized as a defense almost against these giant global economic sort of there's dynamics that like you feel powerless against. And so I'm glad you asked that. Thank you for asking that. And I hope that sort of kind of answered some of what sort of you were raising. Okay, Robin. Yes. And yes, Robertus, the mandala system. Exactly. Perfect example about how, like, especially if you play sort of historical simulator video games, you kind of get the impression that everything in this period and or around the world were always like states in this like, or even nation states in the way we've been describing, and that's just not true because the mandala is not. That doesn't correspond to like what we think of a modern state is at all. There's Auf. Yes, manuscripts. And yeah, completely under researched. A lot of like what we were talking about. I think it was Revin asked about like sort of kind of like, did you kind of see the Hobbesian social contract and sort of Indonesian thought, and really like manuscripts are the way are where to sort of look for these things. Okay, perfect. We've reached the end of everything. I've kept you all here for 2 hours. I'm very sorry. I hope it was worth it. We will reconvene our standard sort of like sessions like this in 4 weeks, but in the meantime, we'll have guest speakers. We'll send out more details on Instagram and on WhatsApp about that soon. But thank you so much for tuning in. 2 hours on a Saturday. I will let you all go, and I need a drink. Thank you.